Goodness. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so sorry. I have a brand new computer and apparently this was my first Zoom meeting with it and it's got issues. So I appreciate your patience. We will kick right into today's session, which is jam-packed. So we will make sure to get through all the materials and certainly intend to share the slide deck as well as today's recording with you. We have built in lots of time for questions and a listening session. So with that, I will share my screen and get started. And hopefully that works. All right. See the screen okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thankfully something went right. That's always a good thing. All right, well, today is our second training for our folks who have opted into our LDD program. We will be doing a couple more sessions before the year is out. So I first want to just again welcome all of you. Today you will see some new members of the MBRC team. Some of them are joining us today. Some of you may have already been communicating with some of them, but since we had our last session, we have been fortunate enough to bring on three new staff members. Sarah Demers, who is serving as our program coordinator. Milena Tamer, who is one of our program specialists. So if you have been working on any sort of reimbursements or closeout or amendments, multiple things, you will have probably communicated with Milena. And then Elizabeth Cross. Liz Cross has our most recent employee who has joined us as our rural health coordinator. Those folks are on the call today, and I'm sure you will be each probably communicating with them over the next several months. I wanted to just give you a brief update, a little bit on the agenda, our capacity work. So we're just going to talk about the next trainings that are scheduled, a couple of brief programmatic updates for both our Catalyst program and our Forest Economy program. We will kick into the NEPA review process with MBRC's consultant, the Clark Group. Patrick Blanchard and Austin Rizzo from the Clark Group are joining us today. So they will conduct that portion. We'll spend a little bit of time going over partial notice to proceed and full notice to proceed requirements. And then we have a listening session, and in the slide deck are what we will hope, in addition to these materials, will be some helpful hints and resources. And like I said, we've built in question time at the end of each segment to make sure people get a chance. So you can unmute, or you're free to put your questions in the chat if that's preferred. So most of you know our LDD capacity work has increased this year with creating an LDD partnership program. All of you opted in to this as an entity who could provide grant administration services to grantees in your service area. What we are trying to do with this program is build it up so that we are providing trainings and really helping you build that capacity and experience both for your entity and also for the grantees who you are servicing. We want you to continue to be a great resource for entities who are interested in applying for our money or learning more about our programs. And to that end, we are offering to do multiple trainings. So we offer to do quarterly trainings. So there'll be this one, and then we have 2 more before the year is out. The upcoming trainings for September and December will be procurement, and the Build America, Buy America will be our agenda for September. Important to note that will be in addition to the new grantee training that we will be doing. So for those of you who are sort of veterans at this, After we make grant awards for Catalyst in August, we do new grantee training, usually in September, for all of our grantees. And we also invite our LDD partners to that. So it will cover a variety of topics. But we feel that the LDD partnership program and really focusing on the training that we committed to doing, there's a couple of pieces that we feel are really critical to that work. The Build America, Buy America, and certainly our procurement processes are extremely important and will time out well in that some of those new grantees will really just be getting started because they'll have just received notice of their award. And then in December, we will be planning to do all things forms. We've heard from a number of folks that with any federal funding, obviously there's a form for everything. And we do have a few forms that seem to present a lot of challenges for different reasons. A lot of it is what version of Adobe you use, but there's obviously different submission requirements at the LOI phase, another group of submission requirements at the application phase, and then throughout the process of a grantee completing their project, there's also reporting and many other forms that come into play. So we thought that would be a good opportunity to both review them and also, just kind of detail those in hopes that they are helpful for everyone. So that's kind of a preview of what's to come on the LDD partnership program. Let's see. So I'll roll right into the forest economy program overview. Some of you are involved in those projects, others, not so much. We don't have the requirement that an entity have to use a local development district for our forest economy program. However, we know that you never know sort of who's going to come to you and ask questions about resources and what funding might be available for a project. So we feel it's important for you to be informed and understand sort of what's happening with all of our programs. So you may recall we did not run a forest economy program in 2022, but we are running 2 rounds in 2023. So this is a first time ever for MBRC in having one of our competitive grant programs have multiple entry points in a calendar year. So we have completed our spring round. These slides are just an overview of what the forest economy program is. We have $7 million in funding. It is a set aside in our appropriation to do this forest economy work. And we've been fortunate enough to already complete 1 round in which we received 17 LOIs and have recently funded 3 projects, totaling about $2.5 million. The remainder of those dollars will carry into our fall round, which is kicking off in early August. So if you are on our constant contact list, if you're not, we encourage you to sign up by sending us an email to admin@mbrc.gov, because we want to make sure you're getting all of our updates. But we recently sent out a notice of upcoming information sessions for the forest economy program. LOIs will be due in late September. We'll be responding to those in terms of invite in mid-October with applications due November 3rd. And then we will make the notice of award in January. So we have 2 annual commission meetings that we do in person. And one is in August when we do our voting and awards for Catalyst. And then in January, we will be doing the forest economy program. A lot of you have been involved in our Catalyst program. Certainly, I think most folks know we received, I think, about 300 LOIs in total. We received about 184 applications that ended up being eligible. So this is certainly our largest program ever at $44 million. We've got 2 categories of funding. So we have the infrastructure, construction and supportive infrastructure that has had a maximum of $1 million for the last few years. And this year we gave consideration to projects that were multiple categories of infrastructure or served multiple jurisdictions, the opportunity to apply for up to $3 million. And then we also raised our grant cap for non-infrastructure projects to 500,000. In prior years, it was 350. So a couple of big changes. In our program materials, you will hear about our partnerships with both EDA and USDA. We do not run those as separate competitions. Projects are selected from our Catalyst program applications for those that align with the partnership dollars. So in addition to the 11 million per state of Catalyst program money, each of the states also have access to partnership funding through both EDA and USDA. We do not make the EDA and USDA program announcements or project announcements at the same time as Catalyst. As you can appreciate, there's another level of review that has to be done by those agencies, but we are moving those processes along as quickly as we can, with the hope to make those announcements in October at the latest. We are at the notice of award time, so we've been reviewing and scoring applications. Our meeting as a commission in mid-August, so hopefully by this time next month, the award selections will be finalized. Mentioned the new grantee training that we will be doing in September. Around that same time, we'll be preparing and issuing grant agreements for all those projects awarded money, in addition to chasing any sort of paper that might be missing from an application. So once we make the awards, it gives us time to get all of our projects in good order by the time we do the training and issue those grant agreements. And like I said, the EDA and USDA notice is a little bit later. We put October on there because it has taken us that long in the past, but we are certainly hoping that it is sooner than that if all things go smoothly. These next couple of slides are just to give you an idea of how many applications were received in your individual states. I mentioned the 184 total applications. So this is really just an informational slide of that breakdown. And this was the amount requested. So while 44 million is a huge program, certainly for us, we are heavily oversubscribed, as you can see. So this is, again, just an informational slide of what those requests ended up being across the 4 states. Brief timeline of our program. So as you can see, we are quickly approaching the end of phase 2. And then this really just kind of is meant to be a demonstration of the timeline of the program in terms of where we are today, and then sort of what's ahead between now and the end of the year. So before I kick it over to our NEPA folks, just curious, anybody has any questions, or and if not, there'll be plenty more chances if you don't have any questions at this time. All right, Austin, I'm going to kick it over to you because I think you're kicking us off. And if you want to just tell me next slide, I'm happy to advance them if that's easier.
Would you mind if I just share my screen?
No, I do not mind.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Now I have to figure out Zoom. Is there any way that the host can enable participant screen sharing?
Yes, I can do that, I think.
All right, there we go. Where is it? Maybe this one. Try this one. All right, can you see the slide? Yes, okay.
Yes. Yep.
Perfect. All right, then I'm just gonna stop my video just because I will be looking at the wrong screen anyway. You don't want to see the side of my face. But just to start off, before I get going, I just wanted to reintroduce myself. So my name's Austin Rizzo. I'm an environmental consultant with the Clark Group. And so what we do is our group specializes in environmental compliance matters. And so with me today, probably can't see him, but is my colleague Patrick Blanchard. And so generally speaking, between Patrick and myself and the president and CEO of the company, Lisa Mahoney, we typically are going to act as the point people for between NBRC.
Austin,
Yeah.
Austin, for some reason, your voice kind of goes in and out a little bit. I don't know if it's your
Okay.
speaker,
Can you
but
hear me better now? Is
yes.
that better? Okay. I will not move around as much.
Okay, thank you.
I like to move a lot, too much for a presentation. Okay. So basically what I was saying is that the three of us generally are going to act as the point people for communicating with NBRC and potentially the grantees on any environmental compliance matters. And so what our group does is that we work on behalf of NBRC and potentially the grantees just to make sure that NBRC is compliant with environmental regulations. Specifically, we're looking at to make sure that they're compliant with the NEPA statute, which we're going to get into in a little bit, but we're also making sure that they're compliant with other federal environmental regulations and also historic regulations. And so why we're going over to this today is that because NBRC is a federal agency and because these projects are funded by NBRC dollars, they are required to be NEPA compliant or environmentally compliant. And so what we're going to cover today in the next few slides is just going over what NEPA is and why it's important. And then also just discussing what does the NEPA process look like for NBRC funded projects. Specifically, we're going to go over some of the requirements that grantees are going to need to go through, and then also some time commitments associated with those requirements. All right. Okay, so starting off, what is NEPA? So NEPA stands for the National Environmental Policy Act, and it was signed into law in 1970 by President Nixon as a way to promote the protection, preservation, and enhancement of the environment. And so this law was enacted due to several growing concerns about environmental impacts due to large-scale development projects, things like dams, highways, and industrial facilities. So around this time period, basically the 1960s and 1970s, there was a number of environmental disasters that were occurring throughout the US. In 1969 alone, there was a Santa Barbara oil spill that happened off the coast of Southern California, resulted in hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil going into the ocean, killing thousands of marine species. At the same time, same year, the burning of the Cuyahoga River, some of you may have heard of this, but basically, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio was able to burn because of the thick amounts of industrial waste that were covering the surface of the waters. And that was not the first time that that river had burned. That's actually like the 12th time or something the river had burned. Around the same time in the early 1960s, some of you may have heard of this book, the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson had came out. And that book really brought to light environmental effects, environmental concerns related to the pesticide DDT, not just on species, but also on humans. So this is a time period where all of these things were kind of occurring. And because of that, they acted as a culminating event that really helped shape environmental protection laws in the US at that time. So around the same time, we had the passing of the Endangered Species Act, we had the passing of NEPA, we had the passing of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. The EPA was the Environmental Protection Agency was also formed at this time. So all of this was happening at the same time. And so this is one of the major reasons why NEPA was passed. So getting into what the purpose of NEPA is, basically NEPA requires federal agencies to consider the environmental impacts of their actions and decisions before they act. So I think I just want to basically emphasize a couple things. First, the word federal agency. So NEPA only pertains to federal agency and federal agency dollars. which is why we're talking about this today. And the other word is the word before. That's really critical here. So NEPA has to occur before. So federal agencies, before they take any action, before they break ground, purchase land, take any action, they have to go through the NEPA process. And so I've heard people before refer to NEPA as kind of a look before you leap. And all that means is federal agencies are just required to do a really thorough analysis on those potential impacts and, let the public know what those potential impacts are before they move forward with an action. What's important to note here is that NEPA actually does not dictate an agency's decisions or actions. And so basically it doesn't require that an agency choose the most benign alternative. So, if you have a project that's going to result in fewer or less environmental impacts compared to another alternative, it doesn't require that the agency choose one versus the other. It just requires that you really take a thoughtful look at what you're doing and inform the public. So NEPA is also referred to as an umbrella statute. And this is going to be very important for NBRC funded projects. So what this means is that NEPA basically requires that federal agencies also incorporate other environmental and historic preservation requirements into the NEPA analysis. So while we're going through the NEPA process, while we're taking a look at the impacts of the project, we also need to consider these other federal requirements. Other laws that typically fall under NEPA are going to be things like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, Migratory Bird Act, Historic Preservation Act. So there are a lot of acts that are that we need to go through as we're going through the NEPA process. But unlike NEPA, as I mentioned, NEPA actually doesn't require an agency to take one action versus another. Some of these other laws actually have what they call legal teeth. And so what that basically means is that they're going to force individuals or agencies to comply with the provisions of those laws. So, if you're building in a wetland, there are certain requirements that you actually have to follow. So generally for NBRC funded projects, I've highlighted these 4. These are the typical ones that we're going to run into. So these are ones we're going to be looking for when we're doing our analysis. So if your project happens to be in a floodplain or next to wetlands, there's what's called an 8-step analysis where we need to look at the impacts of that project on the floodplains and wetlands and see if there's any mitigation measures we can take before moving forward. Another common one is if the project has a potential to impact federally listed species, we need to do what's called a Section 7 consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Again, see if there's any way we can mitigate those impacts and avoid those potential impacts. And then finally, this one's very, very common. You've probably all heard of this, but this is called a Section 106 consultation. And if your project has any ground disturbance at all, or isn't involved with like an older building, we're going to need to do what's called a Section 106 consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office. And we'll need to hear back from them before we move forward. So this one is very, very common. Okay. So getting down to what actually triggers NEPA, why are we talking about this? So basically the primary driver for triggering a NEPA analysis is the undertaking by a federal government of what's called a major federal action. So what is a major federal action? I think this terminology, is really confusing. The word major, I think, throws people off quite a bit. But basically a major federal action is any activity that is undertaken, funded, authorized, or approved by a federal agency. So this actually can encompass things like if a federal agency wants to hire people, if they want to start a new program, if they want to draft a conservation plan, if they want to build a sidewalk, if they want to build a big road, all of that is considered a major federal agency. So it's not just the big things, it's the little things. So, and I've highlighted here the word funded because, again, that's what we're talking about today. NBRC funds these projects. So any NBRC funded project is going to have to is being triggers NEPA. And so that's why we have to go through the NEPA process. All right, let me jump back real quick. So one of the other things we're doing, I've mentioned this before, so we're looking at the effects, the impacts of your project on the human environment. This is another word that trips people up. What is the human environment? A lot of times people think that when we're going through doing an environmental assessment or looking at the impacts of your project, we're just looking at the impacts on fish and wildlife and their habitats, which is true, we do that. But the human environment is actually a lot more, it's much more broad than that. We're also looking at the way your project might influence the socioeconomics of a town, or how is it going to affect traffic patterns, or could it have an impact on the health of nearby residents? So just to illustrate the things that we're going to be looking at, which I think I'll explain why this is relevant in a section second, but I have this example here. So in this example, this is an NBRC funded project. The town wants to put in a new well, and they also want to connect a new water main to that well. So in order to do that, they're going to have to close down this street on the one side of town. They're going to have to dig up the ground. They're going to have to dig up the road. In order to do this, they brought in some pretty heavy equipment. And the project's going to take place sometime in the summer because we're in the north, and it's going to occur like 3 to 4 months. And so things that we're going to be looking for here right away, the things that capture my attention is the big heavy equipment. You could see it's pretty loud. So we're going to be looking at the effects of that heavy equipment, that noise on, we have some nearby nesting bald eagles that are protected by the Bald Eagle and Golden Eagle Protection Act. We're going to need to look at the impacts of the project on them. We also have, this project is occurring in a residential portion of town. So we have a number of houses nearby. We have a preschool nearby, and these are considered noise sensitive facilities. So we're going to look at the impacts of this project on those places as well. And what's important to note, while we're looking at impacts, we're also interested, are there any mitigation measures that we could put in place to help mitigate those impacts? So it's a combination of the two that we're looking at. Moving along, as I mentioned earlier, the street's going to have to be closed down. So we're going to have to look at the effects on traffic patterns, you know, which roads are closed down, how long is that going to happen? Are there any businesses affected? This big pile of dirt here, this is a big one. We'll be looking at, is there any potential for soil erosion? There's a nice river that runs through town and a nearby pond. Is there impacts for sedimentation on those aquatic systems? Is there any impact there? And again, looking at those mitigation measures, if they can put in silt fencing or straw wattles to prevent some of that erosion, we'll be looking at that as well. A couple more. Up here at the top, you see there's a church nearby and a cemetery. So this is gonna trigger that additional federal requirement. We're going to need to do a section 106 because of this, to see if the project has a potential to affect any archaeological resources as well. And then finally, down here at the bottom, we have an old gas station nearby, which has been flagged by the Environmental Protection Agency as being a contaminated site. And so in this instance, we're actually looking at the impacts of this contaminated site on the project and the future operations of that well. So it's not just looking at the impacts of our project on the outside environment, it's also looking at the effects or the impacts of the outside environment on the project and the future operations of a facility or a building. And so the reason why I wanted to paint such a thorough picture here is that eventually the grantees are going to get what's called the NEPA intake form. And in that NEPA intake form, we're going to be asking a lot of very project specific questions. And the idea that we're trying to get across here is we're trying to paint this picture so we have a better idea of the analysis that needs to occur and what potential impacts we might run into. What are other federal requirements that we're going to have to address before we move forward? All right, so the different levels of NEPA analysis. Earlier, I talked about how a major federal action can encompass a wide variety of projects, so really tiny projects, things that you would think would have no impact, and things that are really big. And so the way that we deal with this with NEPA is that there are actually different levels of NEPA analysis depending on the anticipated impact of the project. So if the project's anticipated to have a pretty minor impact, pretty insignificant impact, there's something called a categorical exclusion. And what a CADX is, a lot of people think that this means that they're exempt from NEPA. This is not the case. Basically, a CADX is what I would say like a NEPA light. It's a lighter analysis that needs to occur. And so every federal agency across the US has their own list of categorical exclusions. They're very specific to a federal agency. And we're going to go over what that list is for NBRC in a second. So that's the first level of NEPA analysis. So we see a lot of them with NBRC funded projects. The second list is, or the second level of analysis is an environmental assessment, also known as an EA. And so if a project doesn't fall under a CADX category, and we don't believe it's going to have a real significant impact on the environment, it's almost like an unknown impact, we're going to need to do an environmental assessment. All right, so it's definitely a more thorough analysis here. So these are the two that we always run into with NBRC. The third, I'm just going to briefly touch on it because I don't want to ignore it, but we have never run into this before for NBRC projects, but it's what's called an environmental impact statement, or an EIS. And that's if we know your project is going to have a significant impact on the environment. So if we're doing an environmental assessment analysis and we have some major alarm bells going off as to like there's going to be a big significant impact, it's going to bump it to an EIS. But I would say just for today, we're not going to even pay attention to this third category. So I mentioned every federal agency has their own list. So NBRC, as far as categorical exclusions, projects that typically fall under a CADX are going to be maintenance projects. So, you know, repaving streets, renovation projects, and repair and replacement projects. Generally speaking, these are going to fall under a CADX. If your renovation project, let's just say you're building a residential building, if that renovation is going to increase the capacity of that building by more than 20%, it's going to bump it up to requiring an environmental assessment. And the same thing for repair and replacement projects. So those are typical projects that are going to fall under a CADX. For an environmental assessment, we're looking at bigger renovation and repair replacement projects that are going to, again, change the capacity of the facility or infrastructure by more than 20%. Typically what we see here is new construction. So if you're building a new building or a new trail system, you're going to require a CADX or an environmental assessment, my bad. And then if you're putting in new infrastructure, so say you're in a section of town that doesn't have a water main, you want to put a new water main there, and it's going to connect to the old water main, that's still considered new infrastructure and would require an environmental assessment. Okay, so what does this mean? So as I mentioned earlier, I can kind of consider a CADX as like a NEPA light. So if your project qualifies as a CADX, what we're going to need to do is a real brief review of the project to see how it impacts, briefly, how it impacts different resources. So we're mostly going to be looking for those big federal requirements. So let's just say, you know, you're doing a renovation on an old barn, and that old barn happens to have bats in it. Well, bats, that's a federally listed species if it's the northern long-eared bat. And because of that, we might have to do, we'll have to do that Section 7 consultation. But that's kind of what we're looking for when we're doing that brief review. Important to note here, there's actually no public comment period for CADXs, which makes it a pretty quick process usually. And again, unless another federal requirement is triggered, the one that really comes to mind is if your project's in a floodplain, so you're doing a renovation in a floodplain, that will trigger us to have to do an 8-step analysis. And that actually does have a public comment period. But generally speaking, CADXs don't require that. So moving on to the environmental assessment, as I mentioned, this is a more robust review. This is much more intensive than a CADEX. On average, we're looking at 6 to 12 months to get through the NEPA process. It depends on the contractor you hire, how comfortable they are with NEPA, but generally speaking, we're looking at 6 to 12 months to complete. And additionally, it has to go through a 30-day public comment period. So the draft environmental assessment has to be made available to the public so that they can comment on it. And then we'd have to address those comments. So long story, basically CADEXs tend to be a really short process. Environmental assessments tend to be a much more laborious process. All right, so let's review just like what the NEPA process looks like for NBRC funded projects. So I think of NEPA kind of in two steps. The first step is figuring out what level of NEPA analysis needs to occur, whether you need a CADEX or an EA. And so this is called making a NEPA determination. And so what we'll do is NBRC will send the grantee a NEPA intake form. And the NEPA intake form is going to ask a lot of project specific questions of the grantee. So they're going to fill in that form and kind of try to paint that picture for us that I showed earlier. We're going to need to figure out, what does that project, the scope of the project look like? So they're going to complete that NEPA intake form. They're going to send it back to NBRC. And then the Clark group, we're going to review it. And first, we're going to decide whether it falls under a CADEX or if it's going to need an environmental assessment. That's the first thing we need to decide. The second thing we need to do is determine if there's any additional federal requirements. So specifically, we're looking at whether they need a Section 106 because there's ground disturbance or it involves an older building. We'll look and see if it needs Section 7 because it involves federally listed species. And the third thing we'll be looking for is whether it requires an 8th step because it involves floodplains or wetlands. So that's the first step of this whole NEPA process. Now, the second step is basically, once we've made that determination, how do we go about completing the documentation? So I'm going to go over the easiest one first. So if your project falls under a CADEX category, so after the Clark group has reviewed it, what we would do is we would fill out it's called a CADEX determination form, which basically states your project is a CADEX. We'd also look and see, again, if any of those other federal requirements are triggered. Let's say your project involved restoration of an older building and we had to do a Section 106. We would then append the State Historic Preservation Officer's approval letter onto the bottom of the CADEX. We then send that form back to NBRC. NBRC would sign the form. And at that point, you are done with the NEPA process. And what's important to note here is that NBRC will definitely let the grantee know that they're good to move forward. So for a CADEX, it's a pretty short process, as I mentioned. Okay, this one's a longer process. So if your project requires an EA, after the Clark group decides that it's an EA, we're going to let NBRC know. NBRC will inform the grantee that they need to develop an EA. And again, any other federal requirements. Generally speaking, we recommend, grantees are probably going to need to hire a consultant. Environmental assessments are pretty difficult to write. They're pretty intensive analysis. So we generally recommend that a consultant be hired to draft this document. We do, however, provide an EA template, an environmental assessment template that will make the writing process go a lot easier. So once the grantee is hopefully hired a consultant to draft this document, once the document is drafted, it will need to go to I'm just saying NBRC TCG, but the Clark group will end up reviewing that draft document. So I've emphasized this. This part right here, it typically requires a couple of revisions just to make sure that the analysis is done well. And the point here is that we want to make sure that we're protecting NBRC and making sure that NBRC is compliant with the law. And so that's why sometimes we require 2 or 3 revisions to make sure this thing is ready for the public. So once we've decided it's good to go, it is now ready for what's called a 30-day public comment period. So the Clark Group will draft what's called a notice of availability, which is basically a one-pager explaining the project and giving the public information. So if they want to have a copy of the draft EA and read about it, and if they want to send us back any comments on the project, they can do that. So the NOA is typically published in a newspaper. Following that 30-day public comment period, we'll do what's called a significance review. So we'll incorporate any comments from the public at this point, and we'll also take a look. Is the project are there going to be any significant impacts? If there are, that's when it bumps up to an environmental impact statement. But again, this never happens for NBRC so far, knock on wood. But generally speaking, we don't receive comments, and it typically is ready for its final, like to make the environmental assessment final. So here, this is where the Clark Group will take it from there. We will finalize the environmental assessment. We will write what's called a finding of no significant impact. And so basically the FONS is also called a FONSI. But basically what the FONSI does is it outlines the project again. They're pretty short documents. We identify any potential like minor impacts and then any associated mitigation measures. That's the important thing. So the mitigation measures is basically the grantee will give it to the grantee to make sure they're comfortable with it. Then at that point, they're basically saying like, oh, if we're digging up soil, the grantee is going to put in silt fencing and straw wattles to help mitigate any potential erosion. So that's what the FONSI is basically stating. Additionally, what the FONSI is stating is that there are no significant impacts and that NBRC is comfortable funding this project and moving forward. So following the draft of the FONSI, we will send it back to NBRC. NBRC will review it and then they'll sign it. And then at that point, they've satisfied their NEPA requirements, and NBRC will let the grantee know they're good to move forward. Okay, so one other thing to mention, due to the nature of NBRC projects, they also receive some funding, potentially some funding from states or other federal agencies. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because some of these other states and some of these other federal agents, or definitely the federal agencies, have their own NEPA or NEPA-like process. So in an effort to not be having two agencies doing the same NEPA process on the same project, there are, in some instances, there is potential to piggyback on what another agency is doing. So we can either act as a cooperating agency on the same environmental assessment or CADEX, or we can adopt another agency's environmental assessment. And the reason there's basically, it's a pretty complicated, there's no clear answer. Like if this agency is also funding it, then we definitely do this. It's a little bit more complicated, but why I'm bringing it up today is that in the NEPA intake form that we're going to give the grantee, there's a space for the grantee to actually write the other federal agency that's funding the project or other state agency that's funding the project and the other funding program. Okay, and that's really important because sometimes that can affect whether we can adopt their NEPA or not. And so I just wanted to highlight that today because sometimes this can really help make the NEPA process go by quicker if we can identify this early on in the process. All right, and so this is my last slide, but basically this is kind of a full circle. When I first started out, I said that NEPA needs to be completed before a federal agency can move forward with a project. And basically, I just wanted to emphasize that really NEPA must be completed before the grantee makes what's called an irretrievable or irreversible commitment of resources. So basically what we're looking at is the grantee should not move forward with purchasing land or property or purchasing any equipment for the project, and for the most part, many services. So I know there's a little bit of gray area there, and Andrea is going to get into that in a little bit. But generally speaking, grantee should not move forward with the process before you either have a signed CADEX or a signed FONSI for an environmental assessment. All right, I think we're gonna pause here. I'll stop sharing and then we can have a second for questions.
Austin, this is Andrea. I did answer one question that that was in the chat, but by all means, if my answer wasn't complete or it raised more questions, feel free to unmute and ask the question, as well as anyone else who has questions. This is an opportunity to ask the expert.
Andrew, thank you for that. So I guess when you mentioned that NEPA cost should be factored into the project's budget and timeline, is there then sort of a range of anticipated costs that sort of makes sense as a placeholder, presuming that we'll need either, or is it safe to just presume that you'll need an EA and budget blank for that EA?
Yeah, I mean, there's not an exact science to the exact, to the number. But certainly if you know you're going to need to do an EA, more than likely the grantee will either need to hire a consultant, and that consultant can be helpful in putting together what that budget, is, even if it's just to give them some sort of range of cost. We've seen a lot of grantees who really thought their NEPA process was going to be a lower level. And we've worked with them to rescope their budget so they can use either some MBRC funds or some combination of our money and matching cost share to cover those costs. So, and then we just work with the Clark group to make sure that what's being presented is reasonable. Like we don't want our grantees to be taken advantage of. So we do review the budget that the consultant has proposed and the timeline. Like, is it realistic? Does it factor in the 30-day comment periods, those types of things? So we can give sort of guidance on a case by case, but unfortunately there isn't really an exact number. But we do try to make sure the number that you are given is realistic and fair.
Great. So it seems like that's sort of that gets shared out in the post-grantee sort of dialogue.
Yeah, I think what we gave for guidance this year, and certainly those who've sort of been involved with us for a while realize that our NEPA process has become much more significant in terms of hiring a consultant and really having experts help us. And a lot of that's because our projects have gotten bigger and more complicated. But we've tried to give guidance as to at least putting a line item in the budget of some degree for the completion of NEPA. And then if we have to adjust it further, if they are selected for funding, we would absolutely work with them to do that. Any other questions?
Andrew, this is Bob Clark. So I would assume with the grantee hire a consultant that would have to be competitively bid.
So we have not required our grantees to competitively bid getting an environmental consultant. We've been very fortunate in that a number of our LDDs have that experience and capacity to help. And that is separate and apart from the 2% grant administration. So we would absolutely look at, doing something with an LDD if that's possible. If it's not, then we have not required our grantees to competitively bid that portion. It does have to be if it gets combined with a larger sort of, not just completion of NEPA, but like larger engineering type costs. So it kind of depends. It really is case by case and what they're looking to do. But to move the processes along, we have not required competitive bid for NEPA only.
Okay, thanks.
There's a
Any other-
question.
yeah.
Yep, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, let me go back to it.
It says, is it just the intake form that is required before issuance of notice to proceed? Do you issue notice to proceed prior to completing environmental assessment and or CADX documentation?
Well, that's a perfect segue into the next portion of our program. So what I can do is talk about how we use our partial notice to proceed, and as specifically as it relates to our LDD costs and the completion of NEPA. But the short answer is NEPA is one piece of a number of requirements that are necessary to complete to get to a notice to proceed. So I think you can see my screen. And if that didn't answer the question, by all means, after I go through this slide, if it doesn't answer it, certainly please feel free to raise your question again. So some of you will recall during our first training, we did conduct a portion of that program for a listening session. And one of the things that we heard loud and clear was the difficulty it is for grantees to not have access to any MBRC money or the ability for an LDD to bill for costs before a project receives a notice to proceed. We have seen that sort of heightened by the fact that we, now with the requirements of NEPA, along with, really sometimes it's a brand new grantee and they just need assistance in even compiling the documents that are needed. We have formalized the issuance of a partial notice to proceed to cover these costs that need to be taken care of, like NEPA, obviously hiring a consultant, whether that's an LDD or a private consultant to help complete NEPA, is really the biggest reason we had to formalize this process to give access to some MBRC money. We don't require there to be match and cost share as somebody draws money to pay for LDD costs or for NEPA specific work. So this slide is really to demonstrate what we ask for in documentation to support the issuance of a partial notice to proceed, which really, as I mentioned when I answered the earlier question, it's kind of a scope of work that the entity is going to complete, a budget for that work, and timeline for completion. So pretty specific to NEPA. We understand if someone says we need some money to access our LDD, those costs can cover a variety of things, but specifically as it relates to NEPA, it's a pretty finite group of information that we really need from folks in order to issue that partial notice to proceed. When that information comes in, we review it with the Clark group to make sure, is it really going to be enough money? Is the timeline, have they built in enough of a buffer to make sure they've allocated enough time to complete each step? And once that's confirmed, we issue a partial notice to proceed with very specific details. So some of you who have worked with grantees who are operating under a partial notice to proceed, it gives a budget amount that maximum that someone can access. It talks about specifically what it's for. So for instance, if it's for LDD costs and NEPA related costs, we identify both the total and the amount allocated to each. So it is very specific in what we're allowing to occur under the partial notice to proceed. The only other, and we've only had to do this a couple of times, is when our funds are being used for real property acquisition and a down payment needs to be made on the property before the project will secure a full notice to proceed. So we have worked with our grantees to make sure, because if, for instance, they wanted to use our money for those costs, or they wanted to use that down payment as part of their matching cost share, we certainly want to make sure it's included. So we have used a partial notice to proceed in those couple of instances that I recall, where if we didn't give them some coverage, those costs would not be allowable, which can be pretty significant when we talk about real property. So those are really the instances where we have used the partial notice to proceed. It is by no means sort of the green light to begin to do all kinds of other project-related activity. As I said, it's very specific in what it allows. And so I guess before I kind of go to the notice to proceed, I want to make sure the partial notice to proceed is something relatively new. I know a few of you, I've worked with you on particular projects, so this is, you know, not new information, but because it is something we haven't previously done, I want to make sure, you know, people understand how we're trying to use this to give our grantees access to your costs, and you have a place to charge to before a full notice to proceed, and then also as it relates to the completion of NEPA. So being that I don't see any questions in the chat, so the notice to proceed, which we've talked about several times, and all of you have heard the term, we thought this might be a good opportunity while we were talking about partial notice to proceed and what we ask for from you or from the grantees, what we ask for at notice to proceed. Again, some of you have done this enough times that you probably can write the list in your sleep. But essentially, we look for a fully executed grant agreement, the executed SF 381, our ACH form, so that's your electronic funds transfer form, and an executed acknowledgement of our most recent version of our grant administration and compliance manual. So I mentioned early on in the timeline, we do our notification of award. We run our grantee training, we prep grant agreements and get those issued. When we issue that grant agreement, we provide very detailed email of sort of what is next and what we need back. But we provide the grant agreement, we provide the ACH form, and we provide the manual. So those three documents all have to be completed and executed and returned to us in order for MBRC to then request the obligation of federal funds for that project. So those steps have to occur, even if a project is going to need a partial notice to proceed, because we need to obligate the money to that particular project before there's any money to access. So those first three items happen very early on in the process. And then once that has occurred, often what is happening in parallel is the completion of NEPA. It's securing the documentation of matching cost share. So some folks have identified their matching cost share when they apply, some of it's pending. So essentially we need our matching funds form together with the documentation from each source that the grantee has listed is going to be providing funding, or even for in-kind, there needs to be a source for each source of match and cost share with documentation such as a letter of commitment. Sometimes it will be, you know, for some of our smaller projects, sometimes it's, you know, people have been, you know, have contributed money, and so it's canceled checks. We get a variety of information, but essentially we're just looking for documentation that that matching cost share you've identified on our form is secured. That's also when you would be working with the grantee to get your LDD contract executed. And then obviously the final piece is the satisfactory completion of NEPA. So 6 things in total, 3 that happened pretty early on. And then it's really kind of depending for someone who's getting a KTEX, the NEPA completion happens pretty quickly. But this was really just meant to be a list of those items that we will need to secure a notice to proceed, which are significant and certainly more than what we ask for at the partial notice to proceed. Any questions on those requirements? And if you have a question, it's fine to just unmute yourself and ask. That works. I think
So-
Darren, I think you have your hand up. Yeah.
So just going back a little bit to the partial notice to proceed and getting access to funds to do the NEPA process. So if the LDD, let's say CCRPC is administering and helping with some of that, and we need to find a consultant to do that for our grantee, we can't use any NRBC funds to find that consultant and oversee the NEPA process, because it sounds like we can't access NRBC funds for anything but the NEPA consultant. Is that correct?
No, we would allow an LDD to a grantee to access some money for grant administration. So if a grantee needs to use the LDD because this process is all new and they're not sure where to even begin, the partial notice to proceed is a perfect way to get access to some NBRC money to pay the LDD for some costs, even if that is, recognizing that it's 2% of the grant award, right? So it's not, it's some money, but it may not be, it's not enough for you to do project management. But certainly if they need some guidance on, maybe it's even a list of possible consultants who could do that work, that's probably a great sort of resource to have, is knowing that this is something grantees may be looking for, and having a list of contacts of people maybe in the service area that could be a potential resource. So certainly we would want to work with the grantee to get them a partial notice to proceed to both cover some LDD related costs as well as the cost to complete NEPA.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Fred?
Grantees can contract with an LDD for services beyond the 2%, the things covered under the 2%, correct? So are those costs, can NBRC cover those costs, like working on NEA, or does the grantee have to cover those costs, anything beyond the 2%?
So if a grantee is going to use an LDD to do both grant administration and completion of NEPA, we would want those to be two separate contracts, because certainly the completion of NEPA is very different than that 2%, which is really meant to be for you to help them through the 3-year performance period of, putting together reimbursements or submitting annual and quarterly reports, those types of things. So we would want to see it as a line item with sort of two separate things that are happening, even if both of them are occurring with the LDD, but it is a separate contract and it's outside of the 2%.
And if they have that separate contract, those costs can be split between NBRC and the grantee?
Yes, it just has to be in the budget. Yep.
Right.
We just want to make sure we could see it in the budget, but whether they put it all in our bucket or our bucket and part of their matching cost share, that's kind of really up to the grantee, but those are all eligible costs for sure.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. We don't have any other questions. This is when we sort of open the floor for all of you to give us some ideas about or feedback on maybe some of the things we talked about during the first listening session. One of the things we talked about was access to the LDD, grantee access, so that the LDDs have a place to charge for their costs as early on as possible. So we also heard understanding sort of who's even come for the money, right? Who's interested in securing some money from NBRC early on in the process. So curious if sharing of that information was helpful, or didn't maybe do all the things we hoped it would do. As well as future trainings, if there are some things specific to your organization. NBRC is certainly willing to hear about those. It may not always be the whole group. We will continue to do trainings for all our LDDs across the 4 states. But we also fully recognize that we have LDDs that are varying stages of, capacity, building staff, all of those types of things. So this is just a good opportunity to talk about or float any ideas or challenges that while we're all together. And I would just say this isn't your only opportunity. I'm famous for having meetings and coming up with great ideas days later. So, if there's nothing fresh in your mind right now, by all means, please feel free to reach out to the staff. Most of you know Sarah Lang, who really was our champion in getting this LDD partnership back on track. She has been out on maternity leave, and we are super psyched that she is coming back next month. So, I will be handing the reins back to her in terms of future trainings and those pieces. But just wanted to mention that if you have ideas later, by all means, you can share them with us at any time.
Andrea, this is Heather. I loved the fact that you shared the letters of intent with the LDDs, that list that you gave out. It gave us an opportunity to actually reach out to everybody that was applying for it to see if they needed letters of intent, letters of support, any kind of technical assistance and things like that. So that was incredibly helpful.
That's awesome. That's great to hear. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So my question was about the on some of the slides where there were, where you had images in terms of the NEPA determination and the different processes. There was a lot of detail there that I wasn't necessarily able to capture. Is there like a one-pager or something that lists those steps out separately from those images, maybe?
So we will be sharing the slides, and I believe, and Austin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there are some additional notes in those slides too of some of those pieces, but I can certainly work with Austin and Patrick if there's a way for us to, put together almost like a little cheat sheet of information or something. There isn't at this time, but certainly open to exploring doing something like that. It would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Sure thing.
Is the grant manual or the FAQs going to be updated with the partial notice to proceed process specific to the fact that it can include LDD time in addition to NEPA work?
Yeah, so we are in the process of updating our grant administration and compliance manual. This is typically the time of year where we do it. And this one will have a lot of updates because I think the current version actually still references SEID because our branding happened in between the last version. But yes, there will certainly be some additional information on the opportunity for a partial notice to proceed and how it can be used. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I don't know if any of you utilize any type of like a intake form. The reason I ask is in New Hampshire, the state has partnered with both North Country Council and contracted with a firm who is helping them sort of, they built them sort of like a database. So when someone is interested in funding, they kind of fill out almost like an intake form to kind of give a sense of, sort of who they are, what their project is, kind of what they're hoping to do. And I'm just wondering if that's something that any of you folks use. And if so, if it's been helpful in trying to understand projects like earlier on, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're the right funding source, but it's just come up a couple of times of, we get cold calls too. So just curious if other folks use any type of, intake mechanism in trying to determine, a project and what funding they might align with. So more just throwing it out there as it's come up a couple of times in-house.
We don't use one, Andrea, but that's an excellent idea. Is there a template that we could borrow?
Of course there's not.
Oh, okay.
No, it's honestly like we're thinking about it because it's come up. Like I said, it's come up a few times for us, and I mean, Michelle, I think Michelle's on this training.
Yeah, I'm
She
here,
might be able to
Andrea.
speak to it more, but if just floating it out there, and maybe we can work on coming up with something if people think it would be helpful. And by all means, it could just be a sample, sort of like our LDD contract, and you can alter it and change it to what works for your particular entity.
Andrea, in Vermont, we have a process that involves a project form and it's done by region. And the regions take in projects on this form and then score them and prioritize them. And the top 10 projects are submitted to the state, and they use that to know what the priority projects are in each region. And it's especially for NBRC, but it's used for other grant sources as well. But in fact, Vermont, when the state does their scoring, they use that list in their scoring. So we have a form that we're happy to share that all the regions use for this regional priority project list.
Oh, that would be great, Fred, if you don't mind sending it over. I've talked to Christy several times about that regional prioritization, so I understand it is quite a process. But if you don't mind sharing it, that would be great. And Michelle, if you want to chime in on how you've seen it work in New Hampshire, that might be helpful for folks too. And I know you put something in the chat as well. So.
Yeah, I could speak to that just a little bit for you. So for New Hampshire, for the state overall, we have that. I just put it in the chat. We have a website that New Hampshire's BEA consultant developed, and that's kind of the intake for any projects during this open round and actually all year round. And so it's a few simple questions that they start to gather to find out, is the project a good fit? Who's the contact? What are we looking at for support and development? And it allows New Hampshire to provide not only technical assistance, but in the form of just guidance, but also if there's any specific studies or anything that might need to happen prior to even coming in for a round. So the link that I put in the chat is what we use. We don't prioritize them or anything like that. We really look at them as far as where are they in the process as far as being ready? Are they eligible? Things like that. It's kind of a baseline. We call it an intake. And then usually the majority of the projects that come through this get a phone call or at least a 15-minute contact to have a further discussion before, they really dive deep into the application process. And at North Country Council, as an RPC, we also do a form similar to that. And it's a project intake that we keep up all year round across all of our focus areas within the council, and that really allows us to see what's happening in the region and find the good fit if it's not NBRC funds. And that's kind of how we look at things. In some cases, it's not a prioritization. It's just, what are you doing for a project and how might we connect you or support you?
That's what we do for our SEDS update. So we have an online survey that we send out once a year to update the project list in our SEDS. And we don't prioritize either, but we categorize and put them, into these various categories and determine what potential funding could be done for them. But we send out an online, it's like a survey that they fill out. They pick out what category it goes under, and they tell us what they want to do and how much they think it might cost. And then we talk to them to develop the projects so that we have it on our SEDS project list. So we do that annually for all, state and federal funding.
Thank you, Michelle and Beth. That's great. Like I said, it come up a couple of times in-house, and so I appreciate the feedback and the information. And I see Darren also shared information in the chat. We will make sure to provide you the chat as well as the recording, because sometimes some of the questions come up in the chat and we answer them. So we'll make sure that you have that too, so you get the links that folks have shared. Any other? All right, I'm going to look at my notes, but any other ideas that folks have? Obviously always open to suggestions on trainings that we can do. I mean, certainly the intent, if we're going to ask you to dedicate time, is to make sure it's both informative and a good resource, good way to network. So always open to those ideas, even if you want to email them to us, after today. All right. So I think we're down to our last, just a couple of slides. Again, we will provide you with the recording and the slide deck. This really is just some helpful hints. A lot of these come up from projects in real time. So we've had a lot of questions around notice of federal interest lately. So we thought, and when folks are using NBRC funds to purchase personal property, so we thought it would be a good time to add a little bit of information in there. Always encourage anybody from your organizations who are involved in grant administration to be on our constant contact list. So you can do that just by sending an email to our admin account. I mentioned we're working on the next edition of our grant administration and compliance manual. So certainly our goal for that is by September 1. It may be sooner. If it's sooner, we will send out a blast to let people know. We usually try to time the update of it with our Catalyst program, so that when we're issuing those manuals for folks to acknowledge, that resource is as up to date as possible. So these are really just some helpful hints, nothing more than us trying to give you good information. We've had a lot of amendments, as I'm sure a lot of you know. We're quickly approaching September 30th, which is a huge deadline on federal government, end of the federal fiscal year. So everybody has to do an annual report. We also have a lot of grantees who will be expiring. Certainly if they were a 2020 project, their 3-year performance period is coming to an end. If you're working with entities, even from prior years, they may need an extension or some other type of amendment. I know Casey and Milena of our staff have been working behind the scenes on reaching out to some of our projects where we've had no activity for some time, in an effort to try to be helpful and get projects back on track. So just again, reminders of deadlines, our amendment process, which is clearly laid out in that manual. There's an amendment checklist. So that's sometimes helpful for a grantee to know, like, oh, what do I need to provide if I'm asking for a rescope and a budget adjustment at the same time? And so we're getting a lot of those right now. So that was also top on our, or large on our radar, I should say. So we thought we would add that in there. Certainly the closeout process for those who are ready to do so. So anyway, this is a helpful hint slide, and this is a resource slide. So we've updated, most of you know, because you probably use our website more than we do, but we've updated the website, reorganized it. We've got some new templates up there. Those will be some of the ones we talk about in December of all things forms. The NEPA forms that Austin referred to, we tweak that pretty much every year to try to make it be as informative and as possible and try to eliminate as much of the back and forth. I think I've mentioned before that NBRC will be working with the Clark Group. We're waiting for some federal regs to be put in place, but we are interested in developing our own forms. So this NEPA intake form was really always meant to be sort of an interim from the forms we used to use that really didn't align well with our work. But before we have our new ones, so we are always trying to update that form so it's helpful. The Clark Group has created a bunch of guidance documents and templates, so we're always updating those, and we will put them on the website. And then just some reference documents and websites of where you can find information with some links. So that's those slides, which hopefully will help you. And really just want to thank you all for taking your time to join us and for all you're doing in your service areas. Certainly know with the recent flooding, there's just been a lot of other priorities, and we've thought a lot about our friends and family in those states that have been hit hard. So just want to extend our thanks and just open it one last time if there's any questions. And if not, you will see an email from us very soon with the slide deck and the recording. And by all means, always feel free to reach out if there's ideas you have or things you'd like us to talk about at a future training. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.